Shalom and welcome to a new edition and a new year of Parsha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malaman in Highland Park, New Jersey, the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation Anshe. And joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky Anshe Chesed. A new year, Parsha Talk. Rabbi Barry Chesler, Solomon Schechter Day School, Long Island. How did it feel to end the Torah? How did it feel to start the Torah? Barry, what was going through your mind? Were you thinking about our last conversation on Parsha Talk?
So I think that the key image for us as Jews is the spiral, whereas pagan religion favors the circle. So the circle of life is really a pagan image. It creates the problem for the Lion King, for those of us who loved watching it. But in Judaism, we have a spiral, and it's a three-dimensional spiral. It's not a concentric circle. So every year we have a new perspective. We come above facially where we were the year before and look down at the same thing. So we have the same Torah text every year, but we're different.
Yeah. Jeremy, how was your experience? Anything you want to reflect on as the Torah ended, the Torah began? Just anything going on?
Well, I like what Barry said. The texts are the same every time, and hopefully our eyes are a little bit open. Our eyes are a little bit different. I like the verse in Psalm 119. Gal einai ve'abita niflot mitoratecha. Open my eyes that I can see the wonders of your teaching, and that's my kavanah for Torah study.
Wow, I was thinking, we begin. It's death of Moses, and we're starting over again, and we're starting over again with Bereishit and the story of creation. And I want to bounce an idea off of you. I want to get your reaction to see if I'm onto something or if I just gotta shelve it. Okay, so I'm very much interested in word pairs. Ever since I began immersing myself in Psalm 27, which is filled with 13 or 14 pairs, tzarai ve'oivai, etc., ori ve'ishi, all of these things. There's a certain aspect, a blatant aspect to the pairing of words in that psalm, and that's a feature of the Hebrew language. So if you look at the first day of creation, you have, I counted 6 word pairs implicit in this paragraph, in these 5 verses. Shamayim va'aretz, tohu vavohu. You have or v'choshech. You have yom v'layla, erev v'avoker. So you have 6 sets of paired words, and there's only one word that's not paired. And that word is Elohim.
Elohim.
So the interesting thing, Elliot, Bible critic that you are, in the next story, God's going to be Adonai Elohim because he needs the pair.
So that's the weak point of my case.
No. That's a good point, because as Rashi has it, as Barry was alluding to, the world starts off with Midat Hadin, and it's all orderly and it's all rigor. And at some point, according to this midrash, which Rashi brings, is that's just not going to work, and we need a balance. And so it becomes Adonai Elohim pairing Midat HaRachamim, the attribute of mercy, with the attribute of strict justice. It could work that way.
Okay, but I'm going for here's God. God is outside of creation, and God is the only thing that's not paired, and God and everything else is moving towards this kind of dynamic of a paired existence, and it works its way through all creation, even at the end with the creation of human beings, because the human being, as you know, is created as Zachar v'Nekeva baraotam, which is the male-female creation, but understood largely, it moves into the second chapter, which Lo Tov Hiyot Adam Levado, which seems to be the driving conflict of at least human history, which is the human being can't be alone. And so
I would say, Elliot, that what you're pointing to, I think, is incredibly illustrative and very sharp here about Genesis chapter 1. Most of our listeners will know that there's a creation story in Genesis 1, a creation story in Genesis 2, and I highly recommend to anybody a book called Creation and the Persistence of Evil by the Bible scholar John Levinson, about how Genesis 1 is an attempt to give us an absolutely transcendent, very, very powerful God who needs not defeat anybody or master anybody. Just God is, as you said, outside the world, and the world has its mechanisms, and God is not part of them. God is over and around them. And so what you said, I think, is illustrative, in a literary way about the theological idea of Genesis 1. It's like there are all this stuff in the world, and those things may be paired, and maybe the pairs of those things suggest some kind of like underlying, sexual mythos, right? There's heaven and earth, and then there's male and female, and there's day and night. But God is not one of them. God is transcendent of them.
So what I'm driving at is, many things here, except the idea that this is a story, but it contains some deep philosophical truths that are part and parcel of Judaism. The Genesis 1 doesn't knock you on the head and say what Deuteronomy says, Shema Yisrael Eloheinu Echad. It doesn't really drive that point home. It's implicit. God is one. God has no parent. God is outside of creation, and everything unfolds from basically the word, God's word. Yehi or, Vayehi or. God says it is, and that's the way creation goes. And so creation, rather than being, an interesting thing to put up in a chart and illustrate and teach children, which we all do, the creation story, chapter 1, is really a deep philosophical story on so many levels.
So I just want to interject a couple of points. So first of all, one of the things that your words suggest is something one of my teachers years ago pointed out, that one of the properties of numbers is that they have no synonyms. And that's why in Amos you have 3 and 4, because they're functionally equivalent, but you can't say 3 twice as a word. So you go 3 and 4, or in the poetic expression, 1,000, 10,000. So what you're suggesting is that because 1 is unpaired, it has no synonym semantically either. And so it has to be suggested how different God is by the heaping up of all these different word pairs.
So the punchline of this is Vayer Vayivoker Yom Echad, which is unusual because the counting should be Yom Rishon. It should be the first day. It's here it's Yom Echad, and I think that gives the game away. Basically, it's the day of the one.
The day of the one. That's quite right. The idea of pairs, is also expressed in a great midrash about, that Shabbat is sorry because she is unspoused. This Sunday is Monday, Tuesday is Wednesday, Thursday is Friday, and Shabbat says, I'm all alone, and God says, don't worry, Israel will be your mate. And so we have this beautiful, image of symmetry. By the way, so think about the way that our week is a 7, but many things their perfection is testified to by the number 8, such as 8 days of Brit Milah, or 8 days on the 8th day the animal is permitted to be sacrificed, or the holiday that we just concluded, Sukkot, which is this world creation festival and a temple dedication festival, is culminated in Shmini Atzeret, an 8th day, not a 7th day. So like, what's even number, what's an odd number?
Okay. So as usual, we could spend half an hour only on the first day, but we have so much material in Parashat Bereishit. Barry, talk for a second about Adam and Chava and your what do you see in that story, and then we're going to move to Cain and Abel.
So I like to teach the story as a coming of age story. At the beginning of the story, Adam and Chava are naked in the garden, and they're not embarrassed. Not unlike little kids running around on the beach without any clothes on. And as soon as they eat from the tree, they realize that they're naked and they're embarrassed, which is characteristic of puberty. When we first become aware of our bodies, that our bodies are somehow not, they're both all of us and yet not of us. And we have a great deal of tension as we work our way through adolescence until we come out on the other side. So that Adam and Eve live in a world that's designed for children. Children have everything handed to them. Right? The child is hungry, we give them the bottle.
Right.
And that's not a sustainable world. In other words, if Adam and Eve had remained in the garden, we would not be here. They have no need for kids unless they know they're going to die. And I think that what we have in the story, and there's a lot more that can be said about it, is a working out of the challenges and the rewards of living in the adult world. All the features of the story that we marvel at, the snake, the punishment of Eve, the punishment of Adam, all come to explain phenomena that piqued our ancestors' curiosity. Women, females, humans are the only mammals that experience pain in childbirth, for example. Snakes, when you look around the world, they're the only animals crawling on the ground. And so in our language, we would say Darshani. And so we have the story of Adam and Eve to explain that. I think that what we need to recognize is that Adam and Eve have to leave the garden because our world is not a Garden of Eden.
Is that God's design? Do you think God set them up to with these boundaries in order for the boundaries to break? Do you?
Yeah, I think that we have to understand that I think sometimes, especially in the modern world, we spend way too much time focusing on sin and not enough time thinking about redemption.
Interesting.
But
Jeremy,
I think what Barry said is about the coming of age story is manifestly true. Jews, I think, sometimes have been anxious because Christian readings of the Garden of Eden story are so anti-sexuality. Jews have sometimes been constrained to say no, it's not what it's about. It's not about a sexual awakening. And it says, the birth of Cain and Abel, and the man knew his wife, and it says it in a grammatical structure indicating that it happened before the previous thing. So we like to say that even there was sexuality even in the garden, but it's manifestly true what Barry said, that the garden is a story about that kind of sexual awareness and the shame of body. And I think that that's absolutely true. There's no way to, I don't think, read the story. You have to hold two things. You have to hold that it was a rebellion. Yes, that's true. And that God must have seen that rebellion was part of the system. I mean, you can't read the story of the human being violating the commandment, hiding in shame, being punished and cursed, as like God says, that's exactly what I wanted. No, it is a story of rebellion, but it is also true that we should be among those beings who know the difference between good and bad, and we should have our eyes opened, and we should become, driven out into the world to do everything that we do. So I think the richness of the story is that both of those things are true.
so let me offer the following proposition that Eve is the heroine of the story. That is to say, that
She's
because
the
of
only
Eve,
female, so there's not a lot of competition.
touche, but because of her, knowledge comes into the world. And were it not for her, then one could argue that Adam would be kind of, doing fine.
Okay, so if you're going to do that, Elliot, I think you really have to push the story a little more, because why does Eve eat the fruit? She eats the fruit because it looks good. And
Wait. She eats the food. It is ta'avahu le'inayim. It is desirable to the eyes.
nechmad, right?
Lehaskil. Nechmad
Skill.
haskil. It is good for enlightenment. So it's not just that it's yummy, although it's that too, but it is nechmad lahaskil, and it's seen to impart wisdom to her.
So
Right, and knowledge is pleasing. It comes with a cost, but I think those of us who pursue knowledge get great pleasure out of it. That's part of the pursuit. And the other thing that your words suggested to me is that what we have in the beginning of Bereishit is a world where human beings certainly are imperfect, but there's also a kind of imperfection to God as well. But every time God picks himself up, as it were, and starts again.
Yeah.
In the Midrash, of course, he destroys the world a few times before he gets to ours. But in the Torah, he doesn't destroy the world completely. He can't abandon his original plan completely, but he keeps playing with the plan until he gets to Abraham and decides that he gets it right.
And
No,
even with Abraham, there's an experiment going on. But go ahead, Jerry.
I think that we, Jewish theology has a nice long history, and we've been, practicing this religion for a nice long time. And so for lots of reasons, I'll just peg this on Maimonides, but it doesn't have to be Maimonides. The idea that God could change or God could make a mistake is like, what? That's not this religion. This religion has God as the paradigm of perfection. But in the Bible stories, that's clearly not the case. In the Bible stories, God is a learner and an experimenter and a trier and a failer and a resume and start all over again kind of figure. And it's never more exemplified than in this parasha, which concludes that God says, "I'm so sorry I made humanity. That was a dumb idea."
But he's sorry he made humanity, and he's also curious about the creation of humanity. He's curious about what this human being is going to do and what this human being is going to be. And with that, we can move into the next story, because I think the next story, we could read the next story as a story of divine surprise. Look, what happens is the two boys are born. As you said, Cain and Abel. When Cain is born, she says, "Kaniti ish et Adonai." I have acquired a human, or created a human with God. But Tosef laledet achiv et Havel. She continues to have a child. She has Hevel. And then all of a sudden, one is a ro'et son, one is a shepherd, and one is oved adama. So we don't have any other details that one becomes a ro'et son, one becomes a shepherd, and one becomes oved adama. And already there you have the compressed notion of something's going on, something's very interesting. Why would Hevel be a shepherd when God has already said, you're only going to eat from the ground, right? That when they are cursed from the Garden of Eden, they're told, you are to eat by the sweat of your brow. And here he is, he's tending sheep. So
right, because the sheep can eat the bad stuff that grows on the cursed earth.
Okay.
Right? It's not really fit for human consumption, but it's fit for sheep.
It's fit for sheep, but
Abel is a kind of wise guy.
Yes.
Wait, do you mean wise man or wise guy?
No, I think not a wise guy in the sense of Tony Soprano, but kind of a guy who,
inventive,
he's always thinking a little bit ahead.
He's inventive and he's free.
He's a conniver. He's cunning.
But he also
is like the snake.
He also sees that from a sheep you can get wool, from a sheep you can get milk, from a sheep you can get meat. And I'm offering the following interpretation, which is, even though they've been told don't eat meat, you know what? He has the hunger for meat. Otherwise, what would he be doing? Slaughtering the animal.
So wait a second. So you are going to double down on Hevel not just being a ro'et son, not just a shepherd, but a shochet, and he has been off killing the animals and consuming them, which the Torah does not exactly say, but of course that is what shepherds' general job is. I would like to comment on the fact that as you said, Elliot, when Cain's name, his mother says, "I have made Kaniti Shadad," I've made a person with God's help. The name suggests possession and accomplishment. Hevel's name, it means breath or vapor. And I'm not entirely sure that he is portrayed here as a killer, although he does offer an animal sacrifice. What if he were close to the animals because animals and humans share a kind of spirit, a kind of a breath, which the ground, the produce of Cain, does not have a breath. There's more life in Hevel and less, and a more brutal or more primitive sense for Cain.
I think there's something very, very deep going on in the story, and it has to do possibly with the evolutionary history of human beings. At some point, they learn how to consume flesh for food. And it's probably very early on in human history.
So that's an interesting question. I don't remember my anthropology quite so well, but how do you learn to consume flesh? If you think of animals in the wild, they consume flesh. So I can imagine human beings emerging from that world that would be natural, as it were, to eat flesh. And the real chachma is farming, is committing yourself to growing vegetables.
So yes and yes. The real chachma is growing vegetables, growing grain, and knowing how to transform that. But the real chachma, even before that, is knowing how to use fire, and to use fire in order to create to acquire meat, because it's the most accessible, nutritious, mineral packed, vitamin packed food that makes it efficient for eating and getting your nutrients and growing a big brain, okay, which is
Well,
crucial to human evolutionary history.
so what's we have to take into account is what we call the staff of life is bread, which also requires a fire
Yes.
and sustains a person perhaps more than meat.
Okay. Debatable.
Certainly the ancient people, and this again calls into question the image of Cain, of Hevel as a butcher, not just a ro'eh, a
He was the
shepherd.
first shepherd.
It is that shepherds don't eat the meat unless they kind of have to, because it's a very precious commodity.
I'll tell you something. I'm sorry. I've been watching this guy, this wilderness
This
cooking
what
guy.
do you call it? What?
His name is Tavakul. He lives in Azerbaijan. I find these videos enthralling. He's a shepherd, okay? He's a big guy, and he's got sheep, and he has no problem going out to the flock, taking one of the sheep. It goes off camera, and then it comes back, and you see a carcass. And he chops it up, and he puts all the spices on it, and he roasts it and cooks it, and he invites all the kids from the village to come and eat at the table. I think it's amazing. It's just it's so interesting that here's a guy who's living basically the way our ancestors lived, okay? And he has no problem, and he's getting his full nourishment. And of course, he engages with trade in the marketplace. He buys his vegetables, he buys his flour from the local, wheat, farmer. He does all. There's interactions, but he's got the meat and he's slaughtering, and he has no problem with that. Okay, and I think
no problem. When you say no problem, I'm not proposing that ancient shepherds had moral problems or whatever. I'm suggesting that, first of all, that even the contemporary person who's like living on the land as a shepherd, we can't retroject that 4,000 years ago people had the same relationship to abundance and quantity. So I'm proposing, and what I have read, this is true, that people were not rich enough to eat meat all the time, and there was a special occasion kind of a thing. So that just makes sense to me. Like if your wealth and your economic abundance is in the sheep, you're gonna want to have them hang around long enough to reproduce and have more sheep. You're not gonna want to have them at breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Right, but the males are expendable.
Okay, so
Isn't that true on so many ways of life? The males are just expendable.
however they end up as shepherd and farmer, here's what happened. And this is the startling moment of the story, of course. There is a moment where Cain says, I'm going to make a sacrifice, okay? Vayihi miketz yamin, vayave Cain mipri ha'adama mincha l'Adonai. All right, after some days, Cain brings from the fruits of the soil a present to God. Okay, so, when I teach this, I think, he's bringing potatoes and carrots. The soil is still clinging on to the thing. It doesn't even wash them. He brings them. What does it mean he brings them? Who knows? Does he make an altar? Does he kindle a flame? Does he burn it? It doesn't. But the very next verse says, Vehevel hevi gamhu. Hevel also brings a present. Mibchorot sono umechel vehen. From the firstlings of the flock and their fatness. Okay? So he's already seeing, I think the dynamic is going like this. Cain brings a gift to God. Okay? That's a discovery of, I'm giving back. Hevel says, you want to see a gift? And here's your wise guy statement. I think he is being a bit of a wise guy. So you want to see a gift? I'll show you a gift. I'm going to take the fattest sheep. I'm going to put them on the altar. and I'm going to slaughter them. I'm going to commit an act of violence and shed blood of the animal, and I'm going to burn them on the altar. Because already he must have had some experience with the slaughter, and he must have had experience with discovering something about an animal and something about the smoke. And so God, it says sha'ah, and we always say he accepts, but sha'ah means he pays attention. He pays attention to the sacrifice. So the Vayesha Adonai el Hevel ve'el michato. It's not he accepts it. Whoa. It's like, this is a human being that has made this discovery. I'm paying attention to this. Okay? And then, and he doesn't pay attention to Cain's sacrifice. And that's the moment where Cain says, okay, so you want to see something? I'll show you something.
Well, it's not quite that, though, because first Cain gets angry,
Okay.
right? And God cautions him.
Yes.
And I think, we have to give that its due, because Cain's rage is directed towards God. And I think, at least when I teach this story, that is the key point. Because I think the significance and part of Hevel's name is that Hevel is not really a character in the story on one level. He's a nothing. That's what his name says. The real story is about Cain and God. And God punishes Cain for no good reason. He does not pay attention to his sacrifice. And Cain takes from God something of value to God, just like God took from Cain something of value to Cain.
And what was it that God took from Cain?
He took his attention. In other words, God did not give Cain his due.
So God withheld. God is here for seen
So
as
now
withholding.
Cain is going to withhold the Hevel from God.
All right. So this is where I want to enter into this debate and say that the most important thing that God has to give to human beings is attention. And it comes up at the end of the Torah where God says, I'm going to turn away from you. I'm going to hide my face from you, which is, again, this whole theme of abandonment and turning away, which is the worst possible thing that God could do, it's also the worst possible thing a parent could do, which is ignore or abandon a child. And so here you have this moment, which is so precious because I'm reading it darker, okay? Hevel says, I'm getting your attention. I'm doing something with a creature. It wasn't instructed to me. I'm going outside the box here. You said, till the soil. I'm not tilling the soil. I got animals. I sit on a ledge all day with a flute and a staff, and I watch them, and I take care of them.
They haven't been invented yet. You're Russian.
I take care of them, okay? And when I'm hungry, I go like Tavakul, and I take one out, and I go to the rock, and I bash its head, and I roast it, and I'm very, very satisfied by that, okay? And now I see that my brother is all of a sudden, one day he's very grateful. Okay, I can be grateful too, and I'm gonna do what I do. And this is what God makes attention to. It doesn't give a valence, a positive or negative valence to that attention. It just says, wow, interesting. And that's what the child wants. The child wants to be noticed, right?
So,
the child he's calling out, Cain is calling out for attention.
So the first suggestion of Hester Panim, of God hiding his face, is when Cain addresses God after he's been given the punishment.
Yes.
So he feels the punishment as God hiding his face from him. Right?
Yeah.
He doesn't feel before necessarily that God has hid his face, but now that he's been banished, and I suppose Cain has a local idea of God. God is in a place, and if Cain can't be in that place, then he's going to be banished from God. That is the punishment that's too great for him to bear.
Absolutely.
I can't decide if you, Elliot, if you feel like Hevel is like Joseph, like the brother who doesn't really behave that well, but succeeds anyway. Because first, I'm struck by the fact that Cain is the first one who, in gratitude, wants to make an offering, and Hevel, perhaps he is that bratty little brother who has to do everything better. and he shames. I want to say that Cain's initiative in taking the offering and making the offering seems like it ought to be a good thing, and then it's Hevel Hevi Gamhu. It's almost like an afterthought, or maybe the Gam there means in competitive spirit. But either way, it's not terribly nice or full-hearted in the way that even if it's potatoes and carrots, Cain just seems out of nowhere. It's like, I want to give my potatoes and carrots. And Hevel, there's something that seems not entirely genuine about it, but it certainly is true in the darkness of this story that Cain is a very dark character, and it is in his jealousy. I mean, jealousy is another part of the just so stories here of Bereishit. What is it that makes people behave so viciously? Envy.
Right. It's the violence of it. And I see Cain as the obedient, non-objecting person, and Cain and Hevel as being inventive, and that by creating something new, he attracts attention, and he is the younger. Don't forget, he is the younger. And in the family structure, it's always the youngest that either gets attention or wants attention, and he gets it. And that rivalry, which is the Torah's way of injecting this theme, which doesn't really work itself out until the end of the book of Bereishit. It's all about who gets attention from a parent and who gets attention from the divine parent.
So we need to add something else here about the distinction between the shepherd and the farmer. The farmer is tied down by the land and to the land. The shepherd is a free spirit.
Yes.
He's providing guidance, but let's face it, the sheep know what to do. The earth does not know what to do. The earth has to be tended.
Yes.
And that goes back to the command or the description in Gan Eden, where the man is going to shomer and obey that God.
But the sheep need a shepherd also.
They need a shepherd, but not quite in the same way. So that, when you were talking before, the image that comes to mind is of the cowboy from the Westerns.
Yeah.
They're riding the range. Well, they're needed, but of course the animals are doing all the heavy work.
Right, and that makes it very, very efficient for the shepherd or the cowboy. Right, they're doing a different kind of work, and that's the point.
Right, and that work though cannot sustain a society. It can only sustain a small part of it.
It can sustain
an important part. I don't mean
right, and we talked also about the fact that we see this conflict emerging really head to head at the end of Bereishit, where the brothers who are shepherds are in that grain producing society. They're in a agricultural society, and in fact, shepherds are abhorred in Egypt. They're told to hide that part of their identity, and in fact, they don't. They say, "We're shepherds. This is what we do." In other words, we're going to defy you, and that defiance, I think, is a really important theme. That the human being that God creates is, on the one hand, supposed to be obedient, but shows humanity by pushing the limit, and that's what it means to be a human being. I think.
Well, I think we can also say it shows divinity by pushing the limits too.
Yeah.
Okay. That we have this partnership with God that plays itself out both for good and for bad.
We're always looking at the boundaries, and we're almost reaching the boundary of the time for time. So just how does Bereishit give me the ending of the Parsha? It's talk about dark.
Perfect ending. You think things are bad? Wait till next week.
Next week,
right?
It's a cliffhanger.
You're carring it on the commentary podcast. They say we have to end with crushing morosity. Bereishit, is a story that ends with crushing morosity. I mean, God regrets having made creation. God is and Noach is seen as the person.
Well, that's the thing. Is that like I said before, whatever our theological commitments to God as the model of metaphysical or moral perfection, the Bible does not know that, and the Bible just knows God as a person or a being of infinite resilience. And God says, this was a terrible mistake. I got angels and human females, and I got all kinds of terrible things. I'm going to blot this whole thing out and start again.
Yeah.
Noach matzachen b'nei Adonai. God looks at the world and says, this stinks, this was a disaster, but I can work with this.
Yeah.
So the last word here, I think we have to appreciate that from a human point of view, Noach is a failure. He's born to lift the curse. He's the first human born after the death of Adam. Lamech, his father, thinks the curse is now going to be lifted off the land. And in fact, the entire world is going to be destroyed. So he's God's success, but his family's failure.
Indeed. Wow. You know, there's so much to think about, and it just reminds me of a theme that we touch on from time to time, which is that the Torah addresses so many levels simultaneously. And we haven't even scratched the surface here. And this is where, unfortunately, we have to leave it. We have to leave this because it just opens up more and more discussion we just don't have the time for. But we are so happy that everyone has joined us, and thankful to you for making the commitment to join us for another year of Parasha Talk. We're so happy to have you. And we want to wish everyone a beautiful Shabbat. Shabbat Bereishit. Enjoy.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
That's